Welcome back to a brand new episode of the MMA Beat. It is Thursday, February 8th, 2018. Hello again, everyone. I'm Ariel Helwani, back inside our New York City studio. Also back, it's the A-Team for the second week in a row, I believe. First time in a long time that we've done this 2 weeks in a row. Yeah, so this is very exciting. And guys, I cannot tell you how excited I am for today's show. This is no hyperbole. This is no BS. There is so much going on, and I'm really curious to pick your brain about some of these things. First, let me introduce this panel. You know them by now, but I'll do it anyway. That's Luke Thomas of SiriusXM and MMAfighting.com. That is the man in the hat, Chuck Mindenhall of The Ringer, and of course, MMAfighting.com as well. And that is the man in the shirt, Jeff Wagenheim of the Washington Post. Okay, let's start with UFC 222. That is not the pay-per-view this weekend. That's UFC 221, and we'll get to that a little later on. 222 is March 3rd in Las Vegas, and it was originally scheduled to be headlined by Max Holloway versus Frankie Edgar, a fight that I think all of us were looking forward to. Unfortunately, on Saturday, we found out Holloway out, ankle injury. As of right now, we don't know when he's returning. UFC wanted to save this card. They tried a whole bunch of things, and yesterday they settled on this. They settled on Chris Cyborg versus Yana Kunitskaya, the former Invicta FC bantamweight champion. She's moving up to 145. There'll be a women's featherweight title fight in the main event. Frankie Edgar stays on the card. He's now fighting Brian Ortega in a non-title fight co-main event. So I ask you first, Luke, did the UFC make lemonade out of lemons here? Did they, they didn't have a lot to work with, and I'm going to talk about, and I'm going to ask you guys about some of the other options they explored, but considering what they settled on, what do you make of it?
Not the optimal outcome.
Okay,
why? I don't think it's really fair to say it's a horrendous outcome. I don't think that's true either. But so let's go. They wanted a title fight. You did some reporting on this. Yeah. I mean, we know that they want title fights for pay-per-views. So let's just start. Ready? Heavyweight and light heavyweight, they're taken.
Yep.
Middleweight this weekend.
Yep.
Welterweight, there's Tyron Woodley. That was a possibility, but it just seemed...
Still getting over the shoulder.
Right. Shoulder issues can linger. Yeah. Hashtag Andrew Luck. Then you go down to lightweight. We know what's happening.
Yeah.
We know what's happening at featherweight. Bantamweight, flyweight, all tied up.
Yep.
You go over to strawweight, tied up. You go to flyweight, God only knows. And now you're left with bantamweight and strawweight, which is where we are here.
Featherweight.
Featherweight, sorry.
Yep.
And then Amanda Nunes, God knows what's going to happen with her. We'll see, I suppose, right? So they just didn't have a lot of options. Chris Cyborg was really probably their best if they wanted to keep that. I think what bothers me is they needed to make it a pay-per-view because the amount they'll get on average for, I think, a fight night card from the Fox deal is not as much even for a low-selling pay-per-view. So they said, which way could we maximize revenues even with a card that was only going to be promoted for 3.5 weeks? They went with that option versus what would have been a nice win for the fans and a demonstration of the quality of their roster, making it a fight night card, making Ortega versus Edgar a 5-rounder, making it for free. I think that would have been a nice thing to do for the fans, and they didn't. It's not the end of the world, but it's not the optimal outcome.
What do you think, Chuck?
Yeah, I mean, I was kind of the opposite in a weird way because I was, how there's always this domino effect when they have to cancel or move a card like that. It confuses the rest of the schedule. Like the number becomes something weird. So I was happy in one way that they salvaged it. It wasn't like the greatest. It was, honestly, the Ortega-Edgar fight really strikes you as a good one.
Yeah.
Because you have a guy where coming up the ranks who's that good, who was very polite, by the way, and stepping aside to give Frankie his shot. Remember, and all of a sudden now they're fighting, so it's kind of an interesting little turn there. But ultimately, we started talking about Cyborg against Amanda Nunes, and you're thinking like, well, maybe that, I kind of wanted to see that fight. I don't know how that changes now, if that will happen or what's going to happen with that, but it just, to put something together, it always has a ripple effect, both directions, and you wonder to what extent that will mess with it. Hopefully, for the Edgar and Ortega, the biggest problem, as we talked about, they build contenders to challenge it, and I wanted to see Ortega there, for the winner of that. So it kind of compromised. Now you lop off a guy, and you lose that a little bit, but a good fight, man. I'm excited about that fight, and honestly, what is her name? Look off camera. No, but that fight wouldn't really. Ultimately, it doesn't matter. It's a typical Cyborg fight where you're like, you think about it in terms of not if, but how long. So it still has the same appeal as always.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the fact that that Cyborg's challenger is somewhat of a unknown to many people who follow sport.
I think somewhat is actually putting it very nicely.
Well, I mean, they're diehards who have watched Invicta. They're gonna know her from the Avenger fights, and also because of how the first one of those fights played out and the controversy that sort of add a little bit to it, but it almost doesn't matter in a sense because I mean, short of Nunes fight, Cyborg kind of runs through people, and so the fact that they're bringing in somebody to try to challenge her, is this going to be just another Cyborg showcase? And if that's the case, hopefully it doesn't play out the way the Shevchenko showcase played out this past weekend. I don't think it will. I think this match, even though it's certainly a lopsided match in my opinion, it's not as lopsided because this is a person who has competed at a higher level than.
Cachoeira.
Yeah, exactly. I couldn't even remember the name other than the woman who was the bloody woman.
Yes.
But I'm actually looking forward to seeing the Frankie Edgar Brian Ortega fight. I mean, that's a fight that I think is. I think it's a damn good fight. So I in a way I would love to have seen it, as Luke points out, if this were a fight night and that were the headliner and that were 5 rounds, that'd be a really cool thing. Is this going to sell as a pay-per-view? Well, we'll see what Cyborg can draw.
Yeah, now we're really going to see, what kind of drawing power she has, because 219 did well, but there are a lot of people after the fact saying, well, that was, in large part because of Khabib Nurmagomedov's return. He's, obviously become a star in the UFC. I want to zero in.
Holly Holm, too.
Holly Holm, yeah, of course, don't take anything away. She's a massive star. Still, not as big, but still has drawing power. Let's just zero in a little more on Cyborg Kunitskaya. Cyborg, in a way, I mean, there's some irony here that she's the one who saves the day because she's been this, thorn in their side. And she's almost like, it feels like she's getting the last laugh in the sense that she no longer has to cut to 135, but she still just gets to fight, bloated 135ers. I mean, it's a great scenario. Although, worth noting, Kunitskaya is a very big 135er, and this is something that has flown under the radar, she announced that she was moving up to 145, and she was originally scheduled to fight in a non-title 145-pound fight on this card. That would have been the very first non-title 145-pound fight in UFC history. So this is not someone who, has a history as a 145er, but it is someone who was planning on moving up to 145. So it does make me feel a little better about the matchup. They're not just like shoving her up there. But again, it is Cyborg fighting a relative no-namer. What, if anything, can the UFC do in the next 3 weeks to promote this fight? Is this like, do you just do the Cyborg thing, like just promote her as a killer and just make it as this is another person, that's going to get slaughtered? Or do you even attempt, Jackson Wink? She's got some things behind her, right? You got the Invicta library. Do you even attempt to build her up?
I don't
Do you
know.
have faith that they will do this?
No, I mean, but could you blame them in putting a ton of resources and assets into this? It's too late. They got 223 coming up, which so far still intact, and that's going to promises to be a great night. And I think that the bulk of their effort is going to go in that direction. We've seen now, not only are they stacking cards in certain different ways, where you're getting a big one and then this sort of like desert after the fact, but that's also bringing with it a ton of promotional effort for that one event, and then the sort of humdrum that happens typically after the fact. I mean, you got 3.5 weeks. I don't really believe they're going to put a ton of resources into this. And I really believe that the matchmaking is designed, one, to just, who could we pull out, right? But more than that, to this point, someone asked me yesterday, what would be the difference between like these Cyborg blowouts and what happened between Shevchenko and Cachoeira? And the answer is, I think Cyborg has this reputation where the referees are just on notice watching, especially in the case where it's not someone like Holly Holm, just to see, because they know that the line's about to feast in all likelihood, so they're much quicker about jumping in. You're going to get the old Cyborg in all likelihood. Mm-hmm. They'll probably just going to sell that in a very simple way.
Don't tell Jan Finney that. Jan Finney took a hell of a beating.
That's right.
But,
that's right.
I would... If I'm the UFC, well, first of all, Dana needs to, he could sell a little bit more. I saw on the announcement last night, it was, I wouldn't even call it a down sell. He pronounced the name correctly and giggled.
Yeah.
And
that was it.
So you want to do better than that, but at the same time, I would go in for the Cyborg killer. I would try to sell that aspect, given the short, notice of this fight and everything. You go with the thing that everybody will know about it, and you just try to give her the shine on this fight. The bottom line is I think it looks to all of us like a showcase fight, but the thing that is fun about a fight like this sometimes is when a person is so thoroughly looked over and thought past, if they can show up and be competitive anyway, they can actually become something too in this fight. So if she can show up and be competitive at all, given the platform, like all of a sudden a main event in her first UFC fight, you never know. Like something good could come of it. But ultimately going in and prospect, I think the UFC's best bet is to do what basically Cyborg has had for the last decade, and just think that, hey, this is your killer. Here's your showcase fight.
Yeah, I mean, you booked this showcase fight, might as well promote it as such.
I want to ask you, Jeff, about something that I found to be very telling. That it was something that was kind of unfolding in front of our eyes over the last 4 days. A couple of weeks ago on this program, we talked about this idea of champion versus champion fights, and that perhaps on July 7th they would do 3, right? They would do TJ versus DJ, Cyborg versus Nunes, and of course the already announced DC versus Miocic. The UFC was willing to part ways with two of those fights, two of those champion versus champion fights to save this March pay-per-view. They were willing to book TJ versus Cody Garbrandt 2 and do away with the TJ fight because, of course, if Cody wins, you don't have that fight anymore. And Cody, as of right now, is not really willing to go down to 125. And, of course, they just hemorrhaged the Cyborg Nunes fight, all to save this pay-per-view in 3 weeks. What do you mean?
If the fight happens on March 3rd and Cyborg wins, she can quite easily fight again in July.
Well, okay, maybe in July, but now you have the Rio problem too, and it seems like Amanda Nunes is going to be, I mean, you need someone for that pay-per-view as well. Okay, but what if she loses?
Right, well, this is a risky run with any kind of fight that they do.
So you hemorrhaged it.
Sorry, so I stole Jeff's question, I apologize.
That's fine, but you did hemorrhage it, right? Like, you had these plans, you were building to something. Dana White has come out many times and said, I want to do the Cyborg Nunes fight.
Right.
And now we're doing Cyborg Kunitskaya.
I mean, this is all a very basic problem. They have operationally said we are going to be doing all of this work, and now let's fit in all the fights after the fact where it's happened. We've discussed this many times, but this puts it into stark relief. You can build up in your mind this notion that you can do these mega cards, and maybe you can, provided that everything else preceding that goes exactly as planned.
Right.
And once you pull on one thread, the whole sweater comes apart, which is exactly what we're seeing here. So, to your point, again, the Cyborg case is a little bit different because you would imagine she can get through this fight relatively unscathed.
Fair.
TJ, even if he beats Cody again, I would imagine he's going to take his licks. He got dropped the first time, which would make a July turnaround very, very difficult. But what are they supposed to do? You have a certain standards that you're meeting, and they're all in competition for each other. They have no choice for Peter to rob Paul.
It also points out the philosophy behind the matchmaking in the sense that, you know, for this date, we want to book the champion against this person. But if we push it up a few months, now we want to have him fight in this person. So instead of saying, this is the person, here's our challenger, this is the person who is our #1 contender, this is the person who deserves the next title shot, this is the person who is going to challenge the champion next. They don't do that. They just sort of, it all has to do with setting up some kind of a, you know, almost like the headline is champion versus champion, but we're not filling in the names depending on when the date is. And that's kind of, to me, it just cheapens what they're eventually accomplishing.
What about this one? In May of last year, UFC 211, I don't know if you guys remember this, but Dana White did a scrum saying, guess what? TJ Dillashaw wants to fight Demetrius Johnson. He wants to go down. He wants to stop that streak. And then Cody Garbrandt comes out. He's like, hell no, man. My back is messed up. I'm going to get it fixed. I'm going to fight this guy. We just coached tough. And then there was this weird thing where DJ was like, no, I don't want to fight TJ. I want to fight Ray Borg. And then Dana says, Ray Borg, that fight's not going to sell. And there was that whole thing, right? But in the end, TJ gets his fight, but it's also kind of seemed as like the golden boy because he stepped up to want to fight, you know, DJ. He was ready and willing. He was going to cut the weight. Now he's offered the Cody Garbrandt fight on 3 weeks' notice and says no to it, and he may have just lost the DJ fight because what I'm hearing is not too happy with him turning down that fight. Now we may take away the fight that you asked for that we were happy about back in May. Amazing how that works in 9 months. You go from being the golden boy to the guy in the outhouse because now you don't want to take a fight on 3 weeks' notice. Can I say this about that fight just quickly?
Which one? Which fight?
TJ Dillashaw versus Cody Garbrandt. Yeah. He should not have taken that fight. TJ Dillashaw just won, just banged up, just became a dad. Why should he have to step up on 3 weeks' notice to save a pay-per-view when he was told that he was getting the super fight? Yeah. For what reason?
And he won emphatically. It wasn't like he just won that fight emphatically the first time. So it's like to even want to do it again and have to prove it again. I mean,
now he may lose the DJ fight because he wasn't going to take a fight on 3 weeks' notice?
Again, this whole idea of being the golden boy, stepping up and helping the company and getting this. You make the fights that make the most sense. If you make the fights that make the most sense, it all then, you know, lays out the way you want it to lay out. And it may not lay out the way you write it down on paper at the beginning of the year, but it happens the way it's supposed to happen, which is, at this point, this is the top person to challenge for the title. And after that happens, then we'll move on to the next one. But instead, like, well, you guys, you do this favor. It's like goes way back to the John Jones thing when he wouldn't take the Chael Sonnen fight on short notice and they canceled 151. Suddenly, John Jones, I know subsequently he became a problem child, but at that point, he already was the villain. He was a sport killer because he wouldn't act in not his own best interest as a champion, and as a family man and all the things that, you know, he's a prize fighter. He didn't act he acted in his interest as he should have. And this is, you know, here's TJ Dillashaw doing the same thing, acting as he should, as advocating for his own interest. Why should he be advocating for the UFC's interest?
It's also sort of a weird position for them to argue, like, we're going to cut off our nose to spite our face. Like, the company has positioned that as a priority for them. When you're thinking about their calendar, they need they don't have to make TJ DJ. That's not what they have to do. But it is clearly a priority for them for financial return and for all the other things in terms of creating awareness. It's like threatening to take that away, assuming you have something else that could be as big or bigger or somewhere in the realm of that to allow you to eat the loss, you can threaten that. But I don't know. It's like, how are you going to threaten something that by taking it away, it also damages you in a year that they're still in a bit of a precarious position, sort of a bizarre threat.
And every time Dana White opens his mouth, he ruins another relationship with another fighter. Tyron Woodley. I mean,
yesterday.
Even when Dana White is correct, even when he's right, he's wrong. Like his position that the Woodley Diaz fight doesn't make sense is the correct position. That would be a horrible title fight. But even within that, he still manages to screw it up by attacking his fighter. I mean, which again, Woodley is advocating for his interest as a prize fighter to get the biggest money fight he wants. Diaz advocating to get the biggest money fight he can get. That's what they should be doing. That's their interest. It's the responsibility of the UFC to say, well, no, we're going to book the title fights that should be title fights. You don't need to attack your fighters.
Do you guys want to see the sequel to this fight already, like Garbrandt and
I don't hate it. Like if there wasn't,
absolutely not. Absolutely not.
You don't want to see it.
So that's kind of
not in 3 weeks. But like if it was like properly booked.
Sure.
Yeah. Okay.
But it's also weird because in the same way that we're talking about, Ortega and Edgar kind of cannibalizing the contenders a little bit. It's the same thing when they booked these rematches. Jędrzejczyk obviously with Namajunas, and then all of a sudden on the same card you're going to say that these two guys are playing it back. There's a weird fatigue that comes with that. I heard Dana White mention that something along the lines of people want to see this fight. This is a fight that they want to see. I think that's not entirely true. I mean, timing-wise, I agree. I don't think it makes sense right this second. Cody Garbrandt wasn't like he was holding the belt for 5 defenses and then he ran into this. He had a great performance to get it and then he lost it. And he's so young. It's so weird because we get into these moments where we're watching specific guys and how they're matchmaking going against each other, that you kind of lose sight of the big picture a lot of times on this stuff. But every time I pan back and I look, I'm like, well, I don't want to really see that fight. That's what I
just hate the idea of putting together, like, especially title fights, important fights, just to save a card.
Right.
This doesn't happen in boxing. Like when headliners get injured, they reschedule for 6 weeks later.
So that's the key insight. Number one, two major takeaways. I think the length of fighter memories is growing. They're beginning to realize, TJ Dillashaw stating quite clearly that, when I lost to Dominic Cruz, I had to wait 2 years. Yeah. This notion I'm going to give this guy 2.5 weeks and do it again is just sort of insane. That didn't used to be a thing. It's much more a thing. And I think the other part is there's just a bit of a whiff of desperation here a little bit, right? I mean, imagine if you had, not carte blanche exactly, but imagine what would the conditions have to be for you to have the financial flexibility to say, okay, our headliner fell out. Let's just do a fight night card and not force something. But instead, you're taking something that is a bit of a not crown jewel, but I don't know, man. TJ versus Cody, too, that's a big fight, especially for that division. You're just going to churn and burn that real fast just to save that. It feels like there's a drowning, I don't know, but, they're thrashing in the water here a little bit to get to dry land.
I want to ask you guys again about the Frankie Edgar-Brian Ortega fight. Let's talk a little more about that. Are you surprised that Frankie is taking that fight?
You know how we were talking, I think last week you're like, every now and again you say, thank God for Max Holloway. Yeah. I sort of feel the same thing about Frankie Edgar because I feel like he's a guy that he just wants to fight. I mean, it's the weirdest thing, but like this is one of those things of like, of course Brian Ortega is going to want to step up and take this fight because now now he's got a clear path to a title, But for who?
Although
who has
you argue that if he just would have waited 3 weeks,
he might have. I mean, but given the way they operate these days, but Frankie Edgar has everything to lose. Obviously, he can lose his footing permanently. The poor guy. Has had so many chances to get back into these weird situations, and something happens, and he's right back and behind the 8 ball again. And this is one of those situations. But I will say that what I love about him, man, is he's kind of one of those guys where contenders or hotshot guys come to die. Like they are. Your Rodriguez fight comes to mind, but also, man, going back when he destroyed Chad Mendez at that point, Charles Oliveira at the time, like a lot of these guys, like Cub Swanson. I mean, he shows up in these types of fights and shows you why he's kind of an insider fan favorite. I don't feel like he ever got big on the outside, but every time he does something like this, I have major appreciation for that guy.
And he also may be one of those that dying breed of company men in a sense that the UFC can turn to him and say, "Hey, can you help us out?" Whereas you think that Woodley's going to do a favor to Dana White. That ain't going to happen. I mean, go down the list of all the champions. They're not. He has the UFC president has kind of mocked and ridiculed about half of the champions on his roster, approximately. None of them are gonna step up. Some of the fighters who are rising up also have sort of seen the ire of Dana White, and they're not going to be the ones who are going to step up in a pinch and help out. Frankie Edgar is still that guy. He's gotten some opportunities, courtesy of the UFC, so he's paying them back. But there aren't too many of them left.
Luke, is Ortega ready for Frankie Edgar?
We're going to find out. I don't think so, but I'm looking forward to seeing. I've been wrong about him, and he's been on a hell of a run, too. A guy who you think in the middle of fights, he's like, okay, he's good, but I think we've seen his ceiling. And then he just keeps winning and winning and winning. And his win over Cub Swanson came.
That was amazing.
Shockingly, not easy, but given how hard I thought it would be.
He basically beat him twice in the same fight.
Right.
He was about to beat him in the first round.
He got saved by the bell in that first round. So it's been incredible to watch his rise. I love the fight. I really wish it was a 5-round main event, as I mentioned before. But it's as I mentioned, or as he said, we're so lucky to have a guy like Frankie Edgar. I don't know if he's exactly in that Cowboy Cerrone Darren Till position, but it could be one if Brian Ortega has a big win like that. So it's a great opportunity for him. And I just appreciate guys like Frankie what we need are guys who keep the machine gears turning. That's really what the product needs to keep enthusiasm high. And guys like Frankie Edgar do their part.
And the vulnerability really, it does matter. Like back in the day when they would matchmake, one of the intriguing things when it was one of those guys was made completely vulnerable in big situations. If it was Anderson Silva defending his belt, he's the vulnerable guy, right? Because his thing could come to an end. These days, we protect against that so much. Fighters want to put themselves in the best, situations to succeed. You know what I'm saying? Like continuously. And so, but Frankie Edgar just doesn't do that. He's kind of the throwback to 10 years ago, or maybe even 5 years ago, the guys who are just like, let me just get in there and fight. You know what I mean? So, I guess on that level alone, because even when they made the Holloway, when they remade Holloway Edgar, I was like, yes, this is fine. We're finally getting this fight. And then it falls apart. He does the next best thing, and I like that. I like that he kind of picks up, and gives you something still.
Let's talk about this Nate Diaz, Tyron Woodley story that's been percolating, especially this past week. So they tried to make the fight for 219, although Dana White insists that they did not try to make the fight, that a lawyer who's really Hunter Campbell, the general counsel of the UFC, one of the most important people in the company, who doesn't get enough attention, but trust me, he's involved in all the big fights. These days, sometimes more often than Dana, as he put it, went off the reservation and just tried to make this fight happen. Both fighters were offered the deal. It never came to fruition, monetary reasons. And now, this week, both Tyron Woodley and Nate Diaz did interviews with ESPN saying that, like, yeah, we want this fight is going to happen. And that led to the comments that you were talking about last night on UFC Tonight from Dana White. Let's first talk about this idea of this fight, because Nate Diaz has already said that he wants to come back. We talked about it. I think most of us thought maybe he wants to come back at 155, try to get that Conor fight. Tyron Woodley appears to have a number one contender in the wings. His name is Rafael dos Anjos, and yet here they are trying to make this fight. So, Chuck, let me ask you, what do you make of this matchup?
You love it.
Oh, God, I hate it. The truth of the matter is, I like to look at it first and foremost as a competitive fight. Like, will it be a competitive fight? So that's the first snag, right, in this whole thing, because the last time we saw, and I'm talking about a legit 170-pound fight, was back against Rory McDonald and the stun gun and Marcus Davis and those. His last two fights, though, I mean, he was he was outside, like they were way bigger, they were throwing him around, and it's just, I remember thinking at the time, like, he just shouldn't fight at welterweight. I mean, that's just stupid. So what does he have to offer a guy like Tyron Woodley, who's a wrestler, which has also been a bit of his kryptonite, and probably will not engage in the kind of fight that Nate Diaz wants to play. What will that fight look like? So really, that's the first snag, and that's the thing I don't like. But then you can get into the merit and say, like, well, how does he possibly merit that kind of, jumping in line and stuff? We know with the new owners and everything, that these things are possible now, but still, I don't like that side of it. Secondly, you know what I mean? Having said all that, if they were to book the fight, I'm sure I'd be watching this with as much enthusiasm as anybody else. But it's only because it's Nate Diaz's return.
Right.
You sicken me.
Yeah.
I'm just telling you the truth. It's telling you the truth.
By compliance of occupation.
Yeah.
I didn't. I am being dead serious when I say this. There's been all this time I've been wondering, have you ever looked up the box office returns for Transformer movies? No. Serious question. You ever done that?
I'm not.
I didn't. I did this either. And then one time I was looking up because they announced whatever the latest Transformers, Grimlock, Bangs Your Mom, or whatever the next edition of this is.
That was a good one.
It was a great one. Yeah. I got that at the alternative movie store. But I'm looking at it, and the returns globally, these are like billion-dollar enterprises, each one of these, which is why they keep getting made. But they are, of course, the worst movies imaginable. And I was thinking to myself, how is this possible? Maybe one or two times you can get away with this, but it just keeps. There's like 7 or 8 of these Transformer movies. Mm-hmm. And the reality is, I didn't realize how big the market is for bad content for dumbasses. It is enormous. And I'm dressing this up a little glibly, but it's true. There is a giant market for terrible things for people who have seriously questionable judgment. How is it possible that Transformers 57 is making $1 billion globally? It's because people want to see dumb stuff. There is no way, somebody who claims to be a fight fan, to have any kind of a respectable palate, say that's a fight that they want to see. You are voted off the list of respectable fight palate forever. And I don't blame Nate Diaz for taking it, and I don't blame Tyron Woodley for taking it.
Okay, that was actually my next question.
Because it's totally in their rational self-interest. If you're Nate Diaz, you get to jump 15, 20 guys and get a big potential payday, maybe even a title and a rematch with Conor at 170. Oh, my God. And if you're Tyron Woodley, man, you can say whatever you want about Tyron Woodley's been saying, but he's been paying his dues against top contenders. I don't blame him at all for taking it. It's about the kind of questions and judgment calls that the UFC is making, but they want to sell Transformer movies to the audience. Yeah, no thanks. I've seen enough of that.
Okay, so given that, I mean, the fact that Dana White came out last night and said, absolutely not, it's not happening.
Music to my ears.
You're happy about this.
They canceled the Transformers franchise.
Doesn't that mean it's going to happen when usually when he says it's
I
not
thought so too, but then he was like, I don't know, it's the lawyers, it's Hunter Campbell in this case, right?
Yeah.
So I don't know what that means, maybe you can give a better sense of that, but it seemed to me like he was like, no, for real. Just think about this for a second. Nate Diaz is ranked, I think, 8th at lightweight. All right, okay? And you can debate that, that's fine. At welterweight, he's not ranked at all. You're going to jump Kamaru Usman, Darren Till, Wonderboy, Jorge Masvidal, Maia, RDA. It's crazy. It's crazy and totally indefensible.
Shouldn't the return of Nate Diaz, though, be music to the UFC's ears in this case? Like, it doesn't feel like they didn't even make the call for him to save 222. Like, that's the one non-champion who could probably get away with it, right? Headlining the card.
Yes.
He's that big of a draw. And it just feels like, even the comments yesterday, it just feels like, for whatever reason, maybe they're not buying it. Maybe they just feel like he's too big of a headache. But that's one guy that you should welcome back with open arms.
But remember the desperation point I was making earlier. You want to burn him for March 3rd, don't you? Wouldn't you want to promote that in an appropriate? Or if you're going to
Although, isn't he the kind of guy that could just, like, you don't really need that many weeks to promote Nate Diaz.
Probably
and what
not.
kind of promotion are they really doing these days?
Probably not, but I don't know. It just feels incomplete to just say, yeah, let's have him in, like, oh, we had a fight, it fell out. Well, we'll just get Nate Diaz and his return from 17 months off.
Right.
I don't know. It just feels very unceremonial.
Okay. You like the fight or you don't like the fight?
Well, I don't have a problem with those two guys getting in the cage to fight each other. I mean, the way you characterize it with two different tiers of disagreement with the fight, I would flip it around and say, for me, it's almost say 95% that you cannot have a title fight involving Nate Diaz at welterweight. Even at lightweight, I would argue you can't have a title fight for him, but certainly not at welterweight. As far as, let's say, tomorrow Tyron Woodley did something and got stripped of his belt, but they still want to book him against Nate. I'm fine seeing those guys compete, but you just can't make it a title fight. So that's my thing. Even though I think that I agree that Nate has not shown himself well against welterweights, actual welterweights. It's still, I mean, he's always an exciting fighter to watch. I love watching him fight. I'll always tune in to watch one of his fights, but there just can't be a belt on the line. At least if you want to actually say that your championship belt means something, you can't put one on the line.
And if there's no belt on the line, that fight makes even less sense. You know what I'm saying? Like, it just doesn't
Right. Well,
translate.
Obviously.
Well, more sense than if there's a belt, right?
Well, I mean, why would you
like a
put those
grudge
two
match.
together?
I don't know.
Right. It wouldn't be. It would be a weird matchup because obviously
It becomes
Tyron
a
has
random
the belt.
matchup then,
You can't go non-title fight, but if,
Conor
let's
McGregor
say
belt.
down the road, let's say a year from now, Woodley is no longer the champion, and those guys want to compete. Fine. Even though I would agree with everything you said about the competitive balance or imbalance here, I'd be happy to see them compete. But you just can't book a title fight I mean, for all the reasons that Luke pointed out, you cannot book a title fight like that. It devalues not only that championship, but to me, it devalues every champion. You might as well just walk up to Stipe, everybody down from Stipe down to Rose, and just take away every single one of their belts and say these mean nothing.
So is it fair to say that we all want to see RDA versus Woodley? Is that the fight that they should make?
The best fight available given the circumstances.
Yeah.
And this is the part about RDA. He's ranked. So Wonder Boy's won. You know, in all fairness to Wonder Boy, he had 2 shots. You can't really do that one right. Okay, number 2 is RDA. RDA is coming off 3 wins in a row, new weight class, a nominee. He didn't win, but he was a nominee for Fighter of the Year. It's fairly straightforward here. Yeah. This is the guy.
Okay. Let's talk about this weekend. What do we make of UFC 221? Like, what? I need to take the temperature here. It is a main event. It features, Luke Rockhold against Yoel Romero fighting for the interim middleweight title. Of course, it was supposed to be Robert Whittaker. He gets an amazing string of injuries, unlike any that I've ever seen. Hamstring, an infected cyst, I believe it was, and chickenpox, which is just bizarre. Luckily enough for him, his wife gave birth on Tuesday. He would have been away in Perth.
A lot to deal with all at once.
Yeah, but I mean, it kind of worked out in that way. That was the silver lining. He was able to be there for his daughter's birth. But so they go with Luke Rockhold versus Yoel Romero, and then it's kind of just like a ragtag bunch of Australian fighters. And there is Mark Hunt versus Curtis Blades, but then there's a real big drop-off. This is a pay-per-view. This is worth $60+.
Is it?
I mean, okay, sorry.
They're charging.
They're asking. Sorry, fair enough. They're like, I don't know. Is it fair to ask this is the worst pay-per-view of all time?
Ooh, I didn't think about that's a good question. Boy, it's up there.
Up until this point, my candidate for worst pay-per-view of all time was UFC 177 because it was TJ Dillashaw versus Joe Soto for the belt.
Do you remember who the opener was in that pay-per-view?
I don't remember who the opener was, but I remember some of the other fights, and it was Tony Ferguson versus Danny Castillo as the co-main, but that was a different Tony Ferguson. That was not the Tony Ferguson that we have today. Yeah. Shayna Baszler against Bethe Correia.
It was 147 in Calgary.
Well, that was Renan Barão versus Uriah Faber, Hector Lombard's debut.
Bad,
there was something there. I mean, look at here's my problem. Can I just say, here's my problem with Rockhold versus Romero as a headliner for a pay-per-view. It is a great fight. I love this fight. This is maybe one of the best middleweight title fights.
Great stare down yesterday.
These two are high-level athletes. I want to see how Romero comes back. I want to see how Rockhold looks. Like, Rockhold still might be the best middleweight in the world. This is a phenomenal fight. My problem is both have gone on the record and said they've tried to make this fight multiple times on Fox, on FS1. They were ready and willing and very happy giving this fight away for free. It was supposed to be the headliner in Orlando. They wanted to make it a couple months back. Like, that was the plan. And then so now you're charging us for it with nothing under it. Something's wrong with that picture. Something's not right there.
The other thing is, here's what I don't understand. Pay-per-view is a predominantly, not exclusively, given the Steven Espinosa, Conor McGregor Twitter spat, but pay-per-view is predominantly a North American phenomenon. By predominantly, I mean upwards of 80 to 90%, depending on what's actually being sold here. But then you look at the card, and below the main event, because even before it was, who was the original main? It was Whittaker. Not a big one, but okay, let's take the main event out of it. The rest of the card has been unchanged largely, for the main card anyway. Yeah. So it's like, okay, you designed Saparbek Safarov versus Tyson Pedro. Not a bad fight, I suppose, if you know anything about the fight game, but the whole thing is, and Tai Tuivasa, the whole thing is built around, imagine we had to build a card strictly for Australian television. Yeah. Then the card makes total sense.
It's a great fight night.
Yeah. So, but for a pay-per-view, it feels not only poorly constructed, but like tone deafly constructed. Yeah. And I don't know. I don't get it. I don't get it, to be honest.
I mean, obviously they were trying to tailor it all to Whittaker, right? And this was going to be this big moment. And you try to remember that, and you think, if that had been the case, if it had stayed intact, that it was going to be Whittaker, would it still seem as ridiculous as it does?
Yes.
So, I mean, I would be a little bit, I wouldn't say it would be as bad, though, because the bottom line is you would understand them catering towards it. I understand the depth of what
but Whittaker versus Romero didn't sell well. Do we think that Whittaker versus Rockhold would do gangbusters? Because I don't.
With nothing under it, and Whittaker versus Romero
I'm saying
had
they would have at least made sense. Now you have a displaced, this middleweight fight like you mentioned, they tried to give it away for free, and I think that it's just the knowledge of all that makes it look worse, because it's just, we were at one point when GSP wins his belt, we're thinking maybe in Perth, and I know it was always a long shot, but maybe we're going to get GSP against Whittaker, and all of a sudden that pay-per-view has some kind of hope.
Oh, yeah.
As the thing has played out, it's just, it's been taking shots the whole way. You know, now it's limping into the fight week, and you're like, man, this is just not a pay-per-view. Now, agreed. I wrote about this yesterday, and I was looking at it strains the imagination to see why you would want to pay for this card. Even the Mark Hunt stuff, because he's his own red flag going into these fights these days. I feel like a lot of the North American audience, even though they like to watch him fight, he is not the kind of guy who generates the feel-good thing that he used to. You know what I'm saying? And he's had some losses and things like that. But who knows who Curtis Blades is? You know, it's like it's one of these types of things. Like, yes, he may show up and have his moment where he kind of gets over a guy like Mark Hunt, and then we start paying attention to him. But he's not there yet. So in prospect, it doesn't really matter. You know what I'm saying? Right. So it's a pretty bad card. I hadn't really thought if it's the worst, but I would have to, just off the top of my head, I would say it's got to be right up there with the worst.
Yeah, for sure. But even before Whitaker fell out, the one difference, of course, was that a real title was up on the line. And that was, points back to what we were talking about earlier, how if you start devaluing championships, then what do you have left? I mean, this is a championship. The Whitaker championship is something that has some value, and that would have given it at least that bit of legitimacy. Now, I think the fight that they replaced it with, these two guys are both excellent fighters. I don't know whether Romero will still, every year, every month goes by, you never know what he's got left. But certainly he's got something, and it could be a really fun scrap. But what are the stakes? The stakes are going to be what? The winner gets the fight for the championship.
Yeah, that's exactly what the stakes are.
Already we were going to see the championship. It's almost like we're instead of getting the real thing, we're getting one step back. And is that going to be enough to make people want to fork out money?
And you're still only getting a version of the real thing, even with what's happening since GSP vacated. It's not the linear. It's just such a weird mess.
Oh, man.
And as you know, the pay-per-view is all about not so much the people who are watching this show right now, the diehards who follow the sport, just every minute by minute, but it's all those other folks who are just sort of drawn in when there's something a little bit bigger on the line, and sometimes you just get fascinated by the fact that there's a championship belt on the poster. One of these guys has got a belt. That's a big thing. I mean, I know for myself, I won't be covering this. The Post, they want me to cover title fights, and they're like, well, we'll probably skip this one. We'll go to the next one. We would have skipped the next one too if Cyborg didn't get that fight.
There's a lesson, though, right? I mean, I think that the lesson here is, and I'm not advocating for people to skip this pay-per-view. Like, if you like this card, more power to you. There are some names. And don't give me the whole thing like you can't judge a card, beforehand. Like, you actually can judge
when
a
you're
card
buying it, you can.
Yeah, certainly when you're...
That's all you can.
Absolutely.
You're not allowed as a consumer to make choices about your money.
It's just that there's UFC 24 out of the next 26 weeks. So if you don't buy this,
insane. Dude, their schedule is killing them. It is.
If you don't buy this one, you have by the way, look at the fight night the next week on February 18th, the Sunday night fight night. That card is better than this one, and it's free.
Yeah.
Derek Lewis, Sage Northcutt, Medeiros, Cowboy Cerrone,
sick fight.
James
Austin,
Vick.
Texas, right?
Yeah, James Vick against Trinaldo. Like there's more intrigue in that, in my opinion, than in this one. So I'm not...
UFC schedule is like if they did like NFL London NFL London games 14 days in a row or something.
Yeah.
It boggles the mind.
How does that Austin card end up being better than the two bookends of the Fox card and the pay-per-view?
We just had that with St. Louis and Charlotte.
I know.
But here, so my thing is, like, the lesson here is that if you have an interim champion, and the whole thing with GSP was a little weird, of course, but you can't just promote the guy. If you're gonna promote the interim champion, right, to real champion, and then try to make this fight, you can't do that anymore. And that's like the one glimmer of hope I have with the Ferguson thing, that they didn't promote Ferguson and strip Conor, because then you go back to an interim fight. What they should have done was make it for a vacant title. You can't have Whitaker just become the champion. So GSP vacates the belt.
Right.
100%.
Vacant title, Romero Rockhold is for the real belt, Whitaker gets to fight the winner. Now you go back to the interim title, and it's like, golly, how many times are we going to do this? So if they would have just done that the right way, this would have been fine.
True.
It really would have.
I know, but I mean...
Not worth $65, but it makes me feel a little better because Rockhold deserves to be fighting for the middleweight title. He should not be fighting for an interim belt. It should have been for the real belt. They should have stripped George, as they did, or he gave it up, whatever you want to say. Vacate the interim from Whitaker, have him fight for a vacant title. He can't fight. Romero comes in, winner fights Robert Whitaker.
I try to squint and think like, well, this is kind of the two guys you wanted to see fight before the unpleasantness all happened and the thing went off on a lark. The belt went with Bisping into these other. So it's like you try to return it back to where you were then? Because not a lot has changed. Obviously, Rockhold has fought like once, right? He fought Branch. Yoel has obviously lost a fight, but to me, there's still there's big time intrigue because the fight itself is so good in that sense. Like they're the two of the top guys in that division. I wanted to watch them fight, so it's like there's some intrigue to that. It's just it sucks that so much has happened to take away from it. But if you look at it if this had happened a year and a half ago, before UFC 199, I think this fight would have been a pretty big fight. You know what I mean? So I try to keep that in mind that the essence is still in there.
Okay, let's move along. Let's talk about last Saturday night, and in particular the Valentina Shevchenko, Priscilla Cachoeira fight, and all the controversy that came afterwards. But I want to, if I can, if you guys watched it live or the first time you watched it, forget about the aftermath. Forget about Dana White's comments. Forget about Mari Yamasaki's statement. Just while you were watching it, that first run, did you feel like it was egregious? Were you disgusted by it? Were you bothered by it? Did you feel like, okay, this is going on too long? Did you think maybe she's fighting it out, she's still surviving, she's trying to get out of this tough position, the crucifix, the mount, all that stuff? What were you thinking the first time you were watching that fight?
So, Kaposa on Twitter,
the legend,
Hitman, he noted something. In the days.
By the way, right now he's watching Dubai Fight Night 46.
I know.
He has a string of GIFs.
He truly has. He truly has questionable taste. But he is a smart guy. He noted, he goes, have you guys seen the fight footage? Not the fight footage, I'm sorry. The footage of the open workout of Priscilla Cachoeira, because I did not know who this person was. So I said, if he's raising alarm bells, that's something you should take a note of. So I went and looked at it, and my eyes got like saucers. I couldn't believe what I was looking at. Now, of course, when you're at a workout, you have to have you can't draw too hard a conclusion because they could just be getting loose. Yeah. But there was a real sense you were looking at somebody who was in shape, but at very nascent stages of their technical development. It was quite obvious. So I was like, ooh, that's not good. Then as soon as they squared off and you saw Shevchenko pulling and then countering her like target practice and then take her down with ease, I was getting a little bit concerned. And then, of course, all the damage accrued. And what really sort of stood out to me was when she was going to mount a crucifix or mount, because she was taking those as well, I was looking to see just how Cachoeira was moving. And the big takeaway for me was underneath, moving is not enough, and that's a question about intelligent defense, which is a different debate. But I was looking and saying to myself, what was the difference between this and what Edson Barboza did against Khabib Nurmagomedov? He may have been overwhelmed, but at every single stage, he was doing the technical response. He was firing an underhook. He was getting his hips under him. He was bicep framing. He was doing things that told you he was an educated fighter in those circumstances. She was literally flailing like somebody from who you pulled off the street. Forget all the damage. Just that kind of behavior alone should have been a huge red flag.
Especially for a guy like Mari Yamasaki, who is
black belt.
Exactly. So I'm like, I felt like once I didn't have high hopes. I thought maybe you might get a little bit of being in her own country and everything, I thought maybe you'd get a bit of a spark early. You might see some kind of flash moment where it was going to be fun, and then it might start to take over, right? That's kind of what I was optimistically thinking. But as soon as the pattern was established, and so you saw her being just outworked in every possible way, my whole thought was, especially as it went to the ground and things started happening, is if she survives this first round, if this pattern reestablishes, we know she just doesn't have the technical, she's not there to know what to do. So the referee then will stop it. That's my gut feeling on it. You're thinking if the pattern reestablishes right away in the second round, that's it, because he knows that that's no longer fighting intelligent. You're not defending yourself intelligently. You're barely defending yourself. So as the fight happened in the second round and it goes right back into danger zone and she's taking all that punishment, I only could think, like, if you were tuning in, if you just didn't really watch fighting, it would look like an assault. Like, this person's just getting assaulted on the ground, and the referee's just improving his position and going in there and not doing anything about it.
Telling her to, like, work.
So you're like, she doesn't have the ability. And you, as a referee, you're thinking, hey, man, you know that she can't get out of this, right? You hope that he understands that she can't get out of this. There was no way she was getting out of this. So I just kept thinking of it like that. It reminded me of that, not quite, but the soccer mom thing and all that stuff where you see something that's just so overly matched and you're just like, this is...
the Explode series KO?
Yeah. You're just, you think back to that stuff, it's all going flash through your mind like, this is dumb. Just stop the fight. Save yourself this embarrassment.
Does Mari Yamasaki, Jeff, deserve the blame that he is receiving, the criticism that he is receiving?
I think that he deserves criticism because obviously the fight should have been stopped before it was stopped. and it was only stopped because it was a choke. Because of a choke out. Who knows if she hadn't put that choke in, whether they still might be going. So yeah, I mean, I think he deserves criticism. I find it fascinating. I mean, obviously, Yamasaki has been criticized in the past, but the most notable ones that, in my mind, were fights in the past where he stopped fights too soon, like the Michael Chiesa getting choked out by Kevin Lee was the most recent one I can think of. There was also that Eric Silva fight against I forgot who it was now, but Silva was hitting the guy in the back of the head. This is the famous one where
Carlo Prater.
Carlo Prater, yes, and Joe Rogan was like criticizing him.
Yeah.
But I watched the replay of it, and he did land. I think he was like 10 shots, 5 of them were the back of the head. So I think Yamasaki was correct in that one. But in the past, he's had these times where he's been criticized for being premature in stopping it. I don't know whether that affected him or whether it's just like his judgment is a little bit off.
Well, that is a real thing, right? They start to overthink. But then what about that statement where he says that he was allowing her to be a warrior? Isn't that a red flag?
Sometimes people dig their heels in when they're upon. Some people are better at receiving criticism than others. And so it might have been him just digging his heels in, hey, this is, I was right.
That's a very telling statement, right? I mean, you kind of...
It is and it isn't, right? I mean, it's not what you wanted to hear. It's not what I wanted to hear. But the big question for me, and I literally don't know the answer to this, I looked this up. I was like, how does the NFL evaluate their referees? Their umpires? Do they have the most meticulous process you can imagine? Every call is graded, not just by one person, but by a team. They get the reviews after every game. If you're good, you get better assignments. You have additional training that happens in the off season. Like everything is with a fine-tooth comb to make sure that at every stage they understand what went well, what went wrong, how to correct it, video evidence, how to look at it, the whole nine. And look, they're still going to have complications. What is a catch? What isn't a catch? But the point being is, we don't really know how referees are evaluated. Commissions have decided that the public is not entitled to these kinds of decisions. And I understand that partly, right? You want to protect referees because people can overreact. As an example, Mario Yamasaki, I don't think he made a very defensible call here, but he is a great man. He is not a bad person. He's done a lot for martial arts. And the bigger picture of Mario Yamasaki is he's a great guy that deserves a lot of respect. That doesn't necessarily mean he deserves to keep reffing, and we can have that debate. My only point is, because of the lack of transparency from commissions, we're left in the dark to better understand, are these guys, are they getting additional training? Did CAB MMA go and say anything to him or any other commission, because he's made other bad calls, the Derek Lewis, Travis Brown call. He was late on that too. What did they do about that? We have no clue because they won't tell us.
Well, Luke, one thing though, you draw the parallel to the NFL. They don't have a different set of rules, the NFC East as opposed to the NFC North as opposed to the NFC West. So there's one group that is running the whole show.
A lot more uniform. There's no doubt about that.
And if MMA had,
but intelligent defense doesn't change place to place. That's fairly consistent across the board.
It may change, but it may not change, but there are different ways of interpreting it. And obviously he was looking at it as, we were talking about how she was moving when she was on bottom. He was looking at it as like, I'm telling her you better move or else I'm going to stop this. And she would move. Yeah. And so to him, that was she was defending herself in his mind. Well, I don't think any of us would agree with that.
Yamasaki and CAB MMA, I think, do deserve a bit of credit for being a little transparent because he always faces the music. Now, he puts out a statement. He doesn't do interviews and things like that. Mm-hmm. But even CAB MMA put out a pretty lengthy statement about what they want to see, what they plan on doing. That's a lot more than a lot of other commissions do. A lot of other commissions just hide and never even answer. So it's at least something. Is it good enough? No. Is it a look? I would love to see, and I've mentioned this before, when there's a controversial call in the NBA, there's a pool reporter that gets to ask that referee questions. It's one guy that the media decides who goes, but at least someone gets to ask, why did you do this? Why? I would love if we had something like that. And maybe one day we will have something like that. I feel a little uncomfortable, and you've talked about this, and I want to ask you about it, because I feel uncomfortable with the character assassination.
It kills me.
I don't think he should ref. I think he is an inept ref. I don't think he's good at his job, but I think he's a fine human being. I've met him. He's a nice guy. He's a lovely man. I wouldn't be a good referee either. I'm not trained to do that. I can't be a brain surgeon.
He's a fireman.
Nice guy, yeah. But to talk about him like he's a child rapist just feels it feels uncomfortable.
Dana White said it makes me sick. I mean, it makes you sick. Larry Nassar, who molested 100 or so girls, this gentleman makes me sick. Mario Yamasaki, made a disappointing call that could have gone even worse. But it's not to say that we're not taking the responsibilities of the occupation seriously, but I don't understand. In MMA, if anyone has an opinion or doesn't act that is in some way deemed bad for whatever reason, not only are you then required to say that act is bad, you are required to say that that person, in fact, is some sort of lout. There's this double responsibility there, and I just refuse to do that in this case. Mario Yamasaki and his brother were pillars of the jiu-jitsu community in Washington, D.C. They have 10 academies, not really in that place, but in Brazil as well. That's why Mario left D.C. to go back to Brazil, and I realize those are for-profit institutions, but you should talk to the students there. They are very happy people. They run good schools, and they're good people.
But he's bad at his job.
He is bad at his job.
He is very bad at his job.
And you can say both.
And guess what? This is the best part. If the UFC and Dana White had a problem with him, which they should have a long time ago, they could have told every single one of these commissions. Like you mentioned Derek Lewis and Travis Brown. Guess what? That card happened in Nova Scotia. This card happened in Brazil. He's reffed all over the place. Vegas, to anywhere else in Europe. Like they could say, commission, stop using him. They could say that. The UFC brings in so much money to these districts like Belém. Come on, first time there. They don't have to use these guys. So like the Instagram post, the character assassinations, to me is completely unnecessary. Pick up the phone, tell these commissions, stop using this guy. We don't want this guy in our cage, and then move on. But it doesn't have to go to the level of like publicly shaming the man. I just don't feel like that's necessary. And one other thing. Every time you see this and then you see it on like the Fox post-fight shows. Like if he comes out and says something bad, then it's carte blanche for everyone. Okay, Dana's on board with this. Now I can make, comments about him. It's not right. It's not fair. It's like he's not a bad human being. He just sucks at his job, and there's a big difference there.
Do you know who was really lucky that Mario was in the cage that night? Dana White. Because Yamasaki's taking all the heat for, rightfully so, taking the heat for not stopping that fight, but let's say that fight were stopped when it should have stopped. It still was a ridiculous mismatch, and Dana White came out later on and defended that matchmaking. He says, well, this is what's going to happen. We're going to get a bunch more of that. Oh, is that what we're going to get? Then get rid of the 125-pound division. If that's what we're going to be seeing, those kinds of that kind of matchmaking, then they're the guys that are maybe not as culpable, but they're certainly culpable to the damage that was taken.
Okay, so we said that Yamasaki deserves blame.
Well, one final point on this. I do think he deserves blame. I do not feel that's a defensible thing. But also, could you name 15 refs better than him off the top of your head? Maybe you could. Maybe some of the people on the panel could, but it's hard. My point being is I treat being a ref in MMA like being a quarterback in the NFL. There are 32 teams in the NFL. I got news for you. About 15 quarterbacks are good, and then 5 to 20 is serviceable, and 20 and beyond are your Colt McCoys and whoever else is the quarterback for the Denver Broncos. I don't even know anymore.
Trevor Siemian.
Exactly, Trevor Siemian. And those are the 32 best guys they can find out named Colin. So my point being is maybe Yamasaki's not a top 10 guy anymore. I know he had sort of a bit of a top 10, top 5 rep. Yeah. But I just want to sort of, it's a hard freaking job. And I'm not saying that's what makes it okay, but have some perspective here.
The more you don't hear their names, the better off they that they're doing their job.
Well,
you know what I'm saying?
Maybe the UFC should invest in trying to educate referees and have better. Let me ask you this though. Okay, Yamasaki, blame. Matchmaking, blame. But what about her corner? What about her team who accepted this fight, and then let it go on? You look at the audio, and between the first and second, she's saying, my knee, my knee. And by the way, we come to find out that she suffered a major knee injury, and they're like, forget about the knee, and then offer no great, technical analysis or advice on what to do in the second round.
Don't get taken down.
Yeah.
And so
try harder.
And so this has sparked the debate that comes up, time and again. Why don't we see enough corners, quote unquote, throwing in the towel? And it doesn't have to physically be throwing in the towel. You can call
get a commission rep.
Yes. As we do in boxing. My theory is the show win pay structure. You're putting these men and women in impossible positions because not only are they thinking, okay, like in boxing, it's like, all right, let's live to fight another day. Stop taking the damage. We'll go back. We'll go to the drawing board. We'll figure this out. Here, she's making 10 and 10. She's a first-time UFC fighter. So every fighter, and she said it herself, and almost every single one, says afterwards, no, I want to go out on my shield. I want to be a warrior. I don't want someone. But really what they don't want is they don't want that extra 10,000 to go away. We've all seen Congo Barry. We've all seen Scott Smith versus the Long Island guy, Scott Smith versus
Pete
Pete Sell.
Yeah.
We've all seen those fights where someone comes back from the jaws of defeat, and every fighter believes that, and that's why we love them. That's why they're all different.
Every Darren Elkins fight.
Yes, we've seen those fights. Right. So they say, don't throw in the towel, but they really don't want to lose that 10,000. That system is so broken. These fighters deserve to know what they're going to make the second they step foot in the cage. And they're not show ponies. You know, like I get why the Fertittas instituted that back in 2001, because they wanted to try to drum up interest in the sport, and they thought that. But I have talked to many fighters behind the scenes who say, if I know what I'm going to make, I'm going to go out there and fight my ass off because I want to make that money in the next fight. I want to keep... If I know that I make X amount if I win, that's when I'm going to play it safe, because I just need to get that money. You get what I'm saying? Right. And so I feel like that's a major reason why we don't see it enough. Do you guys have any other theories as to why we don't see this enough in the sport?
I mean, traditionally, and I remember I kind of wrote about this a little bit. I was talking to Doc Hamilton, who's one of the judges, and he's refereed and stuff like that. And he said, I asked him, why don't you see more 10-7 rounds? He's like, because the way it's structured, you would never see somebody, they would have to literally be on the brink of being finished for the whole amount of the round. You'll never see that because a referee will stop the fight. I think in most situations, when somebody's in trouble and they see it, like they go flat for even a second or whatever the thing is, they're taking a lot of punishment, the referee generally steps in. I think that there's an understanding from referees in this sport, the way it's structured and the way our stoppages happen, in most cases, the referee will step in and save you from having to even think about that. There's rare cases, though, where a person is just getting nickel and dimed in the situation. And this particular one, she was getting, you know, taking full-on punishment without it being stopped. This is a classic example. If the referee's not going to stop it, you have to have a plan B, which would be, hey, I'm not going to let my fighter go through this anymore. Just like you said, that would be my thinking on it. You just don't see it usually because you really don't see that kind of one-sided fight that often, where somebody's just taking that kind of punishment. The referee generally will stop the fight. So my theory is that you don't see it because they believe inherently, I guess, that the referee, if it gets into trouble, is just going to stop that fight.
Okay, fair.
I mean, I guess also you're looking at comparing boxing and MMA. In boxing, you do see people throwing the towel. And I know that the show win money, that is a factor that doesn't transfer over to boxing. But in boxing, a loss is probably more significant to your career than in MMA. We see a lot of MMA fighters who are very successful, Hall of Fame type guys who have multiple losses on the record. Whereas in boxing, you know, they kind of, you get sort of escorted through your early career to the point where you're undefeated through your first 25 fights a lot of times. And so a loss is a big deal. So if your corner is throwing the towel in, that's a big deal. But if you're in the ring in a boxing match, you know, Roberto Duran, no mas, you don't ever give up when you're in the ring. The guys outside can throw in the towel, but you're inside, you can't quit. MMA, you're getting choked out, you can tap. So there's a whole different psychology in the two sports. The competitors in MMA are, unless you're from Brazil, you will tap out to a choke or to any kind of a submission. But the people outside, they're not willing to let you give up, or they're not willing to give up for you.
I don't know if they're not willing. I think they're put in a spot where they know their fighter will get mad at them if they do that.
They also have bad judgment. You can look at her corner, Cachoeira's corner, and they're saying, well, we know her limits. Quite clearly you don't. Quite clearly you don't. Matter of factly, you have no clue what you're talking about, quite obviously. So no, that's not true at all. I think. Look, I want to agree 100% with your show win split assessment. There's no denying that it's absolutely true. But you take a case like Gilbert Melendez. I believe his contract is all the money up front. And then you go back to that Jeremy Stevens fight and his own corner. And these are not bad guys. Nate Diaz and whoever else, they're not bad guys. But he was like, I don't know if you used the word I'm done, but you could clearly tell he was in distress. And he kind of wanted out, which I don't blame him for at all. And then they kind of egged him on. He just took more punishment. There is a reality about this. The show win thing is, I don't know whether they will do it, but at least in terms of changing contracts, relatively easy to fix. How do you undo a culture that's still living in this shoot-to-box era where they valorize taking a beating if you can't win? I don't know how you fix that except with just the raising awareness for these kinds of situations.
You worded it exactly right, and I think that, was it Trevor Whitman? There was somebody like maybe
Trevor Whitman, UFC 188.
It was UFC 188, and he said, hey, if you don't start doing something, I'm throwing the towel in. I think that was the first time I actually was like, wow, that's how these corners should take. That's how they
What's his background?
Boxing.
Exactly. So I'm like, the thing is, though, you heard it and you're like, why don't we hear that more often? Her corner should have been saying that, hey, if you can't get something going, we will throw the towel. You know.
Last thing on this, a very high-level UFC fighter texted me about this, and he made a great point. He was saying, whenever you see someone in those situations where they're taking a serious beating, try to find the corner audio. He goes, more commonly than not, what you'll hear is I forget, maybe you said it, Jeff. where they were like, try harder, get up. And what he's saying is there's two problems there. One, that instruction ain't helping them. But two, if the UFC hears that, they should think long and hard, not only about thinking that booking that fighter again, but having that camp again, because that camp is putting people in a position that they're not making informed judgments about who they allow to go fight at the highest level.
And then there's the other thing where it's like, I see people say like, oh, was it worth it? Well, you know, for most of these fighters who are in that position, who are getting beat up like that, they don't have a lot of money.
13 grand?
Yeah.
I mean, that's a ton of money in Brazil, depending on your background.
They do not have a lot of money, so these people are put in positions where they're like...
And percentages going to those people in the corner, too.
Absolutely. So it's a tough spot for all. We hope that these situations don't happen, and I fear that it may happen more in these new weight classes. Like, I'm not saying abolish the weight classes, but we just have to be very careful about the matchmaking. And you also kind of feel bad that it takes something away in a weird way from Shevchenko, who we should just be talking about glowingly here. Like, she looks like maybe the best female fighter on the planet. You know, like that opening sequence was just...
It was insane.
It was jaw-dropping.
Like Neo in the Matrix.
Yeah, when you're fighting against somebody who is a huge underdog, she basically erased any possibility of like one of those crazy knockouts that you know sometimes happen when you've got a big underdog who just wings a big punch, a prayer.
Yeah.
She took away that opportunity by taking her down. She lit her up on the feet for what, 20, 30 seconds, and then just took her down and said, okay, now we're just going to fight down here.
There's so many things about this sport that I feel like we just kind of accept, and when you take a step back, the other one, which we don't have enough time to talk about, but I'm sure will come up, in one of the many cards that are to come, the weigh-in thing. Again, Jaw Dotson doesn't get money, and he's like, well, where's my show money? Well, it doesn't say it, as you mentioned, it doesn't say it in your contract that you deserve that money. Like, get it in writing. Like, the days of just trying to say, like, oh, this is the way it's done, I'm going to get that locker room bonus, those days are over. And I think that the sooner the fighters realize that this is a new era, this is new ownership with different objectives and budgets and things like that, those locker room bonuses and those unmarked envelopes, or we'll give you the show money, no doubt. Like, it's not happening. Like, how many more times does it have to happen? And I feel like we just have accepted all these things about the sport. It's time to assess these like weird idiosyncrasies about MMA. Yeah. Anyway, all right. Okay, so now what we're gonna do is we're gonna turn the table to you, but there's actually a little twist. There's a little twist. Usually we take your questions around this time. We're gonna do after the MMA beat, but I'm gonna start off with my own question, okay? And that question is about the best in the world.
God, kill me.
That question is about CM Punk. So if you want to know what these men think about CM Punk's probable UFC return, switch over to Twitter right now, live.twitter.com/MMA fighting. After that, we're going to answer some of your questions. You've asked us some great ones this week. So this is what you have to do. Minimize YouTube, MMAfighting.com, Facebook, wherever you are watching the show and enjoying it live, go right there, live.twitter.com/MMA fighting. What does Luke Thomas have to say about CM Punk's return? Oh, you can't wait to hear this. It's coming up right now after the MMA beat.